He actually said that in front of Lady Danbury.
I cannot believe it. What an impertinence.
Oh, but you must admit it was rather amusing.
You should know this about Vivian Hartwell before anything else. She was not the kind of woman who made promises she did not intend to keep. Which is precisely what made that particular Tuesday afternoon, with its thin January light and its smell of wood smoke and cold tea and the faint, desperate laughter of 6 unmarried women crammed into Lady Forsyth's drawing room, so catastrophically consequential. I'll marry the first man who walks through that door. The room erupted. Teacups rattled in their saucers. Lady Forsyth pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Someone knocked over a seed cake. Vivian had meant it as punctuation, a means of piercing the suffocating silence that had descended after word arrived that Lord Calder, her third declined offer in as many months, had quietly withdrawn his interest without the courtesy of a reason. She had lifted her chin. She had made them laugh. And then the door opened. He filled the frame the way a storm fills a horizon. Not dramatically, not with any visible effort, but simply because something of that magnitude has no choice. Lucian Vane, the Duke of Wycliffe, stood with one gloved hand still resting on the handle, his dark coat exhaling the cold of the street into the overheated room, his gaze moving across 6 frozen women with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once required an introduction to make himself known. The laughter died in 6 different throats simultaneously. He was not handsome in any forgiving sense. His face was carved too sharply for comfort, his jaw a severity, so his eyes so dark and unreadable they invited no speculation, only the faint, instinctive certainty that speculation would be unwise. He was 34 years old, and had buried a wife, ruined a viscount's political career without raising his voice, and kept the precise circumstances of both events entirely to himself. Whether one story connected to the other, no one in polished London society had ever possessed the particular courage required to ask. He had not been expected. Lady Forsyth had gone the colour of old wax. Vivian had not gone pale. She had gone very, very still, in the manner of a woman whose mind was already 3 moves ahead of her expression, calculating something she had not yet decided to calculate, toward a conclusion she was not yet prepared to reach. Wycliffe's gaze crossed the room and found her. So it did not move on. He had come here with a purpose. That much required no interpretation. It lived in the deliberate set of his shoulders, in the way he had not yet released the door handle, as though he was still deciding how long he intended to stay. He had not come for any of the other 5 women currently discovering urgent interest in their embroidery hoops. Vivian Hartwell held his gaze across 12 feet of Persian carpet and felt, with the cold and perfect clarity of someone who has just heard a lock turn, that the joke she had made 30 seconds ago was no longer a joke at all. The drawing-room had not recovered its breath. Lady Forsyth stood, which she rarely did for anyone, and performed the introduction with the mechanical precision of a woman operating entirely on social instinct, while her mind ran in quite another direction. Your Grace. Miss Hartwell. You are, yes. How extraordinary. Tea? Wycliffe declined the tea. He declined the seat she offered. He stood in the center of the room as though he had always intended to stand precisely there, and the other 5 women rearranged themselves around him with the unconscious deference of iron filings near a lodestone. Vivienne did not rearrange herself. She set her teacup down with the particular care of someone who requires a moment for their hands, and she looked at him, fully, without apology, the way she had been taught ladies ought never to look at gentlemen they did not know. She was nearly certain she knew him. Not his title, not his name. Those had come with Lady Forsyth's breathless introduction, but the architecture of that face, the exact angle of that jaw, the quality of stillness he carried like a second skin. She had encountered those before, somewhere stripped of drawing-rooms and correct behavior, somewhere she could not immediately locate, as though the memory lived behind a door she had not opened in a very long time. He knew it too. She was certain of that, and the certainty was unsettling precisely because his expression offered nothing to confirm it. Whatever recognition lived in him, he had long since learned to keep it below the surface. Miss Hartwell. His voice was what she had not expected. Lower than his presence suggested, and oddly careful. The voice of a man who had learned that words, once released, could not be recalled. Your Grace, she returned. Around them, 5 women found urgent occupation. Lady Forsyth murmured something about the fire and vanished toward the hearth. Wycliffe did not acknowledge any of it. His attention remained on Vivian with a focus that was neither warm nor cold, simply complete, the way a physician examines a wound he is deciding whether to treat. I wonder, he said, if I might speak with you privately. The room, which had been pretending not to listen, stopped pretending. Vivian held his gaze. 12 feet of Persian carpet and 5 years of something she had not yet named lay between them, and she was aware, with the cold, a crystalline awareness that had always served her better than sentiment, that agreeing to a private conversation with the Duke of Wycliffe in Lady Forsyth's drawing-room on a Tuesday afternoon was the sort of decision that could not be unmade. She was also aware that she was in no position to refuse. Of course, Vivian said, and she watched something move behind his eyes. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something older and considerably more complicated. Whatever he had come here to say, he had not expected her to say yes so quickly. Lady Forsyth's morning room was small and smelled of dried lavender and the faint, ghostly remnant of a fire from 3 days prior. Vivian stood near the window. Wycliffe stood near the door. Neither of them sat. This, she understood immediately, was not a social call. You are aware, he said, and without preamble, that your father owes a significant debt to my estate. The window was very cold at her back. She was grateful for it. My father's financial arrangements are not my area of expertise, she said, which was not quite a lie. She knew about the debt. She knew its precise figure, its terms, the date by which it would be called. The 15th of March, which was 6 weeks away. And she knew that her father, who was 61 years old, and had the particular optimism of a man who had never once been adequately punished by consequence, believed it would resolve itself as all his debts had resolved themselves, through the patience of others. Wycliffe did not appear to be a patient man. £14,000, he said, borrowed against a land deed your father no longer possesses clean title to. My solicitor has been corresponding with yours for 7 months. I know. A pause. She had surprised him again. It cost him less this time. He was recalibrating faster. Then you understand why I'm here. I am beginning to, Vivian said, though I confess I had not anticipated your chosen venue. Lady Forsyth's Tuesday afternoons are considered somewhat beneath your usual visiting habits, Your Grace. You have not attended a domestic gathering in, I am told, nearly 4 years. Something moved at the edge of his jaw, not a flinch, a compression. My habits, he said evenly, are not the subject of this conversation. No, she agreed. My father's debt is, and the fact that you came here, to this room, and to speak to me specifically, rather than continuing to correspond with solicitors, suggests you have decided on a solution that requires my participation. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, rain had begun against the window glass, a thin, persistent sound. You are nothing like what I expected, he said, and it arrived not as a compliment, but as an observation being filed away. Categorized, stored, assessed for future relevance. Women rarely are, Vivian said. What is your proposal, Your Grace? He told her. It was clean, precise, and entirely devoid of sentiment. The debt forgiven, her family's home secured. A marriage of arrangement, not affection. A contract between 2 people with adequate reason and no illusions. He would require an heir. She would require nothing beyond what the law entitled a duchess. And she stood very still while he spoke, and when he finished, she said, And if I refuse? His answer was very quiet. Then the 15th of March will arrive on schedule. She turned back to the rain-struck window so he would not see what that did to her face. She did not give him her answer that day, This was deliberate. Vivian had very little leverage in this negotiation, and she intended to use what she possessed with the economy of someone who cannot afford waste. Time was one currency she still controlled, if barely. She rode home through the January cold with her hands folded in her lap and her mind working in the orderly, relentless manner that had always alarmed her governesses and exhausted her mother. By the time the carriage turned into Hartwell Street, and she had constructed and demolished 4 separate arguments against marriage, 3 arguments in favor of it, and 1 argument so bleak she refused to complete it. The house was warm. This surprised her, briefly. Coal was not cheap. And then she understood that her father had been entertaining. She found him in the study with a glass of port and the general appearance of a man who has recently been told good news he has not entirely earned. "Vivian, you are late. I had begun to— Who was here?" she said. Her father set down the port. He had the handsome, softened face of a man who had once been genuinely charming and was now coasting on the structural memory of it. He looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to read at age 9, the one that meant he had done something she was going to have to manage. Lord Pemberton called this afternoon. He wished to discuss— Lord Pemberton's cousin holds a seat on the lending committee of the bank from which you borrowed against the Wycliffe note, Vivian said. If Pemberton was here, he was not making a social call. Her father blinked. You know about the Wycliffe note? I have known about the Wycliffe note for 5 months. I know its terms, its figure, and its due date. I know that you borrowed against a land title you had partially sold 2 years prior, which makes the instrument fraudulent, and that if the Duke chooses to press that particular point with his solicitor, the consequences extend considerably beyond lost property. The study was very quiet. Vivienne, her father said. How long have you— Long enough, she said. Sit down, Papa. I need to tell you what happened today. She told him most of it. Not all. She kept the particular expression on Wycliffe's face when she turned to the window. That was hers, and she was not yet certain what to do with it. Her father listened with the expression of a man watching someone else climb a wall on his behalf. He wants to marry you, her father said when she finished. He wants to secure a debt and produce an heir through the most efficient legal mechanism available, Vivian corrected. Marriage is the mechanism. Is there a difference? She looked at her father, this man she loved with the exhausted, structural devotion of someone who has spent 2 decades protecting a person from themselves. And she said, yes, and it matters which one it is. She left him with his port and walked upstairs. In her room, as she opened her desk drawer, removed a single folded letter and sat with it in her lap in the dark. She had found it 3 weeks ago in her father's correspondence. It was not addressed to her. She had read it anyway. She had not yet decided what to do about what it contained. She sent her answer the following morning. Yes, 1 word. She had written and discarded 11 more elaborate versions before arriving at the one that cost the least to give. Wycliffe's response arrived within the hour, which told her 2 things, that he had been waiting and that he had not expected to wait long. Both were useful pieces of intelligence. The response itself was brief, formal, and arranged a meeting at his solicitor's office for Thursday at 2 o'clock. There was no warmth in it, nor any pretense of warmth. She found she preferred this to the alternative. A performance of gallantry from a man who felt none would have required her to perform reciprocal gratitude, and she was running very low on performances. Thursday arrived with pale, exhausted light and streets still dark with overnight rain. The solicitor's office smelled of old paper and beeswax and the faint, dry anxiety of legal consequence. Vivian sat across a large mahogany desk from a Mr. Forsyth, no relation to the lady, that she had confirmed, and listened while the terms were read aloud in the neutral voice of a man professionally committed to having no opinion. Wycliffe sat beside her. Not close. There was a precise, deliberate distance between them, the width of a social convention maintained as carefully as a surveyor's line. And yet she was acutely aware of him in the manner of being aware of a source of heat. Not warmth, exactly, but the specific sensory fact of it. At one point, Mr. Forsyth asked her to confirm her understanding of a clause regarding property held in her own name upon widowhood, and she answered clearly, and Wycliffe turned his head. She felt his gaze at the side of her face. She did not turn. "Miss Hartwell is thorough," he said, to no one in particular. "Miss Hartwell read the draft contract your solicitor sent to mine," she replied, still not turning. "I annotated 3 clauses. You accepted 2 of them." A pause. "I did," he said. "The third?" "Required more consideration." She turned then because the quality of his voice had shifted. Not in volume, not in inflection, but in some interior register she didn't have a name for yet. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in Lady Forsyth's drawing room. That particular, careful attention that was not admiration, not assessment. Something between them, something that did not yet have a category. "There is something I wish to ask you," Vivian said. "That has nothing to do with the contract." "Ask. Have we met before?" Mr. Forsyth became extremely interested in his inkwell. Wycliffe held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She counted them, and then he returned his attention to the papers on the desk. "The contract requires your signature on page 4, he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned to page 4. But she noticed, with the cold and perfect precision that had always been her finest instrument, that he had not said no. They were engaged by Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, London knew. Vivian understood the mathematics of this. 6 women in Lady Forsyth's drawing room, 1 solicitor, 2 sets of household staff. Information in a city like this moved the way water moved, not because anyone pushed it, but because the channels had been cut long ago by accumulated habit. By Saturday, she had received 11 letters. 7 were congratulatory in the cautious, hedging manner of people who had not yet decided whether this development was fortunate or disastrous. 3 were from women she barely knew, written in the breathless tone of those who had determined it was disastrous for her, and wished to be the first to say so with the appearance of concern. 1 was from her mother's sister in Bath, who asked only, "Is he as cold as they say?" Vivian set that one aside to consider. The first public occasion after the announcement was a musicale at the Carver House on Saturday evening. Not large, not intimate, but possessed of the particular social temperature of an event where everyone present knows something has changed and is waiting to observe the shape of the change. Wycliffe arrived 20 minutes after her. She heard the quality of the room shift before she heard his name announced, and it was something she suspected she would never stop noticing. The way a gathering reorganized itself around him, subtly and without acknowledgement, the way buildings respond to wind. He found her in 7 steps. She counted those too. She had developed, it seemed, a counting habit in his presence. "Miss Hartwell, Your Grace." They stood together for the first time in public as an acknowledged pair, and Vivian was conscious of every gaze in the room conducting its private audit of them. She kept her expression even and her spine straight and her gloved hands entirely still. "You are being observed," he said, very low for her alone. "We both are," she replied. "You appear unbothered by it." "I have had considerable practice." "Yes," she said. "I imagine the observations were rather more hostile 4 years ago." She felt him still, and it was the first time she had referenced, obliquely but unmistakably, his first marriage. She had not planned to do it here. The words had arrived with a will of their own, propelled by something she didn't yet trust herself to examine. "That," Wycliffe said after a moment, "is a conversation for a different occasion." "I agree. I simply wished you to know that I am aware it is a conversation we will eventually need to have." He looked at her. The candlelight did complicated things to his face, sharpened what was already sharp, cast the rest into something that was almost, in the most technical and conditional sense, vulnerable. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "Not a question." "No," Vivian said. "Should I be?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was so quiet she had to hold herself still to hear it. I haven't decided yet," he said. She could not tell if it was a warning or something closer to an admission. The music began, and neither of them moved. She found the letter on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into the engagement, tucked inside a copy of a state correspondence that Wycliffe's secretary had forwarded to her attention at her father's house. Standard material, a review of the Wycliffe properties she would nominally oversee as Duchess, household budgets, staff arrangements. She had asked for it. She had read through it methodically, making notes in the margin. The letter was on page 9, inserted behind the Hertfordshire property summary. It was not addressed to her. It was not addressed to Wycliffe. It was addressed to the late Duchess, dated 4 years and 3 months ago. Before the marriage, before the title, before whatever had happened in that house that no one in London had the courage to name aloud. It was in her father's handwriting. She sat at her desk for a very long time with the letter in her hands. Then she read it again, slowly, in case she had misunderstood the first time. She had not misunderstood. Her father had known Lucian Vane's first wife, not in the vague, peripheral manner of shared social circles, known her specifically, privately, in the way the letter's particular register of address made unmistakable. My dear Cecily. The handwriting, the phrasing, the nature of what was asked. A warning. Her father had written to the first Duchess of Wycliffe 3 months before her death and warned her of something. The letter did not specify what. It referenced only a previous conversation, a confidence shared, and her father's increasing alarm about a situation he described only as what Vane intends. What Vane intends. Vivian set the letter on the desk. She pressed her hands flat against the surface and breathed. She thought about the note she had found in her father's correspondence 3 weeks ago. The one she had not yet confronted him about, the one that had felt, then, like a peripheral mystery. She understood now that it was not peripheral. She understood that she was standing at the center of something that had been in motion long before she walked into Lady Forsyth's drawing room, long before she made a careless joke, long before Wycliffe walked through the door. She thought about the way he had looked at her in that drawing room, not with the blankness of a stranger, but with something older. She thought about the solicitor's office, the 3 seconds of silence when she'd asked if they had met before, and the careful, deliberate non-answer he had returned. He knew who she was. He had known before he walked into that room. The engagement, the debt, the contract, the clean and efficient mechanism of it. None of it had been coincidence. None of it had been circumstance. She picked up the letter. She read her father's handwriting one more time, what Vane intends. And then she stood, put on her coat, and called for the carriage. Wycliffe was going to answer her question. Today. Not with silence, not with a careful deflection back to contracts and clauses. She was going to stand in front of him with her father's letter in her hand, and he was going to tell her exactly what he had intended. Then, and now, and every deliberate step in between. And she was not at all certain she was prepared for what he might say. The butler at Wycliffe House took one look at Vivian's face and stepped aside without a word. She had not sent a card. She had not waited to be announced. She had ridden across 3 London streets with her father's letter inside her glove, pressed against her palm like a coal. And when the door opened, she walked through it with the particular forward momentum of a woman who has decided that the ordinary protocols of polite society are a luxury she can no longer afford. Wycliffe was in his library. She knew it before she was told. She could see the light beneath the door at the end of the corridor, that specific amber quality of a room where a fire has been burning for hours. The butler gestured, and she did not wait for him to knock. Wycliffe stood at the sound of the door, rising from behind a desk that held 4 open ledgers and a glass of something he had not been drinking. He took in her face, her coat still fastened, her gloves still on, and whatever he had been about to say dissolved before it reached his mouth. She placed the letter on his desk. He looked at it. He did not touch it. She watched him recognize it. Not from the handwriting, not from the date. but from some interior knowledge that preceded all of those, some awareness that this particular document existed and had always been the thing most likely to find its way to her hands. "Sit down," he said. "No." "Vivian, my father wrote to your wife," she said, 3 months before she died. "He warned her about you, not he called it what Vane intends. I have been standing in that phrase for 2 hours now, and I require you to tell me what it means." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind pressed against the library windows, rattling the glass in its panes. "What it means," Wycliffe said slowly, "is considerably more complicated than anything I can explain while you are standing across a desk from me with that expression. Then I suggest you begin before my expression deteriorates further." He looked at her for a long moment. She had seen many variations of his careful, assessing gaze by now. She had become, over 3 weeks, something of a student of its gradations. This one was different. This one held something she had not seen in him before, and it took her a moment to identify it, because it was the last thing she had expected to find in the face of the most feared duke in London. It was dread. Not of her, not of the letter, of what he was about to have to say. "The debt," he said. "Sit down, Miss Hartwell. I will tell you everything, but I need you to understand, before I begin, that I came to Lady Forsyth's drawing room intending one thing, and I am no longer entirely certain that thing was right." She did not sit, but she did not leave. He told her in the manner she had come to associate with him. Precisely, without ornament, in the voice of a man who has learned that sentiment in language is only a way of asking to be forgiven before the damage is fully understood. His first wife, Cecily, had been the daughter of a baron without money and with considerable personal warmth. He had married her in the year of his father's death, when he was 29 and in no condition to assess anything clearly. He had, against all the arrangements of his nature, loved her. Vivian said nothing. She had folded her hands, and she kept them that way. Cecily had died 14 months into the marriage. A fever, swift and indiscriminate, the kind that arrives without negotiation and leaves behind only the dimensions of what has been lost. There was nothing sinister in the death, and he said this without being asked, in a tone that suggested he had been required to say it many times. What he had not said publicly, what he had spent 4 years containing, was that in the weeks before Cecily's fever, she had been frightened of something. He had not known what. She had been warm and then suddenly careful, and then she was ill before he could ask the right question, and then she was dead. He found the correspondence afterward. Not one letter, several. Going back 8 months, charting a relationship between his wife and Vivian's father that was not romantic. He was deliberate about this, methodical, presenting the evidence as he had assembled it, but financial. Hartwell had been the man who introduced them, who had, Wycliffe had come to understand, arranged the match in the first instance, brokering Cecily's hand to the Wycliffe family in exchange for certain considerations no solicitor had recorded. When the considerations didn't materialize, Hartwell had gone back to Cecily directly, pressing her, asking her to influence her husband. When she refused, he had begun to suggest, in increasingly unsubtle terms, that he possessed information about her family that a duke with political ambitions might find inconvenient. Cecily had been frightened because she was being blackmailed. "By my father," Vivian said. "Yes." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. "The warning in the letter," she said, "was a reversal. By the time he wrote it, he had frightened her badly enough that he grew alarmed at his own work. He warned her about what Vane intends, meaning me, that meaning he told her I had discovered the correspondence and was preparing to act against her family." Wycliffe paused. "I had discovered nothing. I was in Yorkshire. He invented my intentions to manage her, and instead he terrified her in the final weeks of her life." Vivian was very still. "And the debt," she said at last. "The £14,000. The fraudulent land title. You held that for 4 years." "Yes." "And when you decided to call it in?" "I found your name on the household correspondence. His daughter, unmarried, managing everything he had, not the capacity to manage. He stopped. Something moved across his face. That unnameable thing, the one without a category. I had not intended. What happened in that drawing room was not what I had intended. She looked at him across the desk, across the open letter, him across 4 years of his grief and her father's cowardice and the specific, terrible architecture of what had brought her here. "What had you intended?" she asked. He held her gaze and didn't answer. She picked up the letter. She put it back inside her glove. And she walked out of his library and out of his house and into the February cold, which was easier to breathe than the air she just left. She did not go home. She went to her aunt's house in Clarges Street, her mother's sister, who had written from Bath asking is he as cold as they say, who was, as it happened, residing in London for the season, and who opened the door herself at Vivien's knock with the expression of a woman who has been expecting a version of this visit for some time. Aunt Georgiana was 61 years old and had never married. She had also, in her youth, she'd been the closest friend of Vivien's mother, which meant she possessed a specific and occasionally inconvenient category of knowledge about the Hartwell family that predated Vivien's existence. Vivien told her everything. Not the version she had told her father. All of it. The letter, Wycliffe's account, the blackmail, Cecily. She sat in Georgiana's small parlour that smelled of bergamot and old silk, and she laid it out with the same methodical precision she would have applied to an estate ledger, because that was the only way she knew to hold something that would otherwise hold her. Georgiana listened without interrupting, which was not her habit. When Vivien finished, her aunt sat for a moment with her tea cooling in her lap. "You knew," Vivien said. "Something. You knew something." "I knew your father was not an innocent man," Georgiana said carefully. "I knew that Cecily Vane's death disturbed him in a way he could not fully account for. He drank more after. For a year, perhaps. Then he stopped, and I hoped, that whatever he had done, it had punished him adequately." "It had not," Vivien said. "He borrowed against a fraudulent instrument and let the consequences accumulate until they required his daughter to manage them." "Yes," Georgiana said, and there was a grief in her voice that had nothing to do with Wycliffe. "That is very like him." Vivien stared at her tea. "What did you know about Wycliffe? Before all of this, what was said about him?" "That he was devastated by her death and blamed himself for not seeing what was happening, and that he closed off in the way that men who cannot accommodate grief tend to close off. Entirely. Architecturally." Georgiana paused. "That he was never the monster the gossip required. That the gossip was largely the work of people who found his silence more threatening than explanation. He orchestrated this engagement." "Yes." "As what? Repayment? Revenge?" Georgiana looked at her with the particular patience of someone who can see something the other person is refusing to see. "My darling girl," she said, "what did he say when you asked what he had intended?" Vivien opened her mouth, closed it. "He didn't answer," she said. "No," said Georgiana. "I don't imagine he did." Vivien left an hour later with 3 things she had not possessed when she arrived. A clearer understanding of her father's history, not a more complicated picture of Wycliffe's, and a decision still forming at its edges but unmistakably present. She was going to end the engagement. Not in flight. Not in fury. On her own terms, with her own reasons, in her own word, because she was not a mechanism for someone else's reckoning, regardless of how justified that reckoning might be. She would tell Wycliffe himself. She owed him that, at least. She sent no letter. She appeared at Wycliffe House the next morning as she had appeared 2 days prior, unannounced, direct, her spine carrying the whole weight of what she had decided. The butler stepped aside again. She found Wycliffe not in the library, but in the entrance hall, coat in hand, gloves half drawn, in the precise attitude of a man preparing to go somewhere. He stopped when he saw her. The gloves stayed half drawn. "I was coming to you," he said. "I am here instead." He looked at her, that complete, unhurried attention, and some assessment occurred behind his eyes. "The morning room?" he said. "Please." The morning room was lighter than the library, less armored. Sun came through the south window in pale, wintry quantities. Vivian stood near the fireplace. Wycliffe remained by the door, which she noted without remarking on. "I'm going to release you from the engagement," she said. "I want you to understand that it is my decision, not a negotiation. My father's debt stands. I'm not asking for forgiveness of it, and I'm not asking for anything from you. And I will find another arrangement for the 15th of March. There is no other arrangement. Then I will find a new one. Vivian, you brought me into something that preceded me," she said. "The debt, the letter, your grief. I understand why. I am trying very hard not to be unjust to you because I think you are not a dishonorable man, and I think what my father did caused you genuine, lasting damage. But I am not Cecily's replacement. I am not a mechanism for settling what was taken from you, and I am not able to marry a man who chose me for reasons that have nothing to do with me." Silence. "They did by the end," he said. "Have something to do with you. By the end is not sufficient." "No." His voice had changed. Not softer, that was not a mode available to him, but stripped of its habitual architecture. "No. Oh, it isn't. You are entirely right." She had not expected agreement. It arrived like cold water, and she absorbed it without showing what it cost her. "Then we are in agreement," she said. "We are not in agreement," Wycliffe said. "I am agreeing that you are right. That is a different thing." He moved away from the door, crossing toward the window, standing with his back partially to her, in a posture she read as a man trying to organize something he has never organized before. "I arranged this because I wanted to understand what Hartwell had taken from me. I'd constructed something very clean in my mind. A debt called in, a negotiation conducted, a conclusion reached. I had not constructed you. I am aware. I don't know what I intended by the time I walked through that door," he said. "I'd been standing outside it for 8 minutes, and I'm telling you that because you deserve the full account. 8 minutes. She felt that land somewhere she had not guarded adequately. "It doesn't change what was," she said. "No, but I am asking you not to forgive it. Not yet. To give me the space to show you what it might become." She looked at his back, at the rigid line of a man unraveling one careful thread at a time. "I will think about it," she said, and left before either of them could say the wrong thing or the right one. The letter appeared in 3 society papers on a Friday morning. Not a private correspondence. A formal notice set in the small, authoritative type reserved for legal matters and public clarifications. In the name of Lucien Vane, Duke of Wycliffe. Vivian read it at breakfast in her father's house, while the tea went cold beside her plate, and the undersigned wishes to make known the following: that the debt instrument held by the Wycliffe estate against the Hartwell family, in the figure of £14,000, is hereby forgiven in full, and the instrument destroyed. Furthermore, the undersigned wishes to state publicly that Miss Vivian Hartwell bears no responsibility, moral, financial, or social, for any obligation incurred by her family, and that the engagement recently announced between them was proposed under circumstances that placed undue burden upon Miss Hartwell without her full knowledge of the conditions surrounding it. The undersigned considers himself solely responsible for this circumstance and releases Miss Hartwell from any obligation, stated or implied, with the sincere hope that her future remains entirely her own to determine. As the notice ran to 2 more sentences of legal formality. Vivienne did not read them. She read the paragraph above 3 times. Then she set the paper down and sat with it. He had done this publicly. Not a letter to her, not a private dissolution. He had put his name in 3 newspapers and told London that the engagement had been his mistake, that she had been uninformed, that she owed him nothing. And in doing so, he had handed every gossip in the city a perfectly shaped narrative in which the most feared duke in London had behaved badly toward a woman and said so in print. He had not asked for pity. He had not positioned it as gallantry. He had stated facts with the same precision he brought to everything, and the facts were damning, and he had printed them under his own name. She was at his door within the hour. He answered it himself, arm which told her the butler had been warned. He looked, and she would carry this particular image for the rest of her life. Like a man who has done the thing that needed doing and is not certain he will survive it. Not dramatic, not performed. Simply present in the way that people are present when they have nothing left to manage. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. Your reputation is not your concern. Lucian." His name arrived without decision, without ceremony, the first time she had used it, and the sound of it changed the quality of the air between them. "What did you think would happen?" "I thought," he said, "that you would have what you deserved, a clean exit, your name intact, your future unencumbered." He paused, "And I thought that I would know, having done it, and whether I had simply been trying to finish what I began 4 years ago, or whether it had become something else entirely. And," he looked at her, everything he had spent 4 years keeping below the surface arrived at once in his face. Not dramatically, not like a flood. Like a tide that has been building against a wall for a very long time and has finally, quietly, found the place where the mortar gave. "It became something else," he said. "Some time ago. I don't know precisely when. I know that I stood outside Lady Forsyth's door for 8 minutes because I was trying to decide whether I was still capable of doing what I had planned. And the answer was that I was not, and I walked in anyway, because I didn't know what else to do." "You were not capable even then," she said slowly. "Yes, no." "And you told yourself it was still the original plan." For approximately 3 days. Vivian stood on his threshold with the cold February air at her back, and the whole complicated wreckage of the past weeks between them, and she felt, with the precision that had always been her finest instrument, the exact weight of what he had just given her. Not an apology constructed for effect, not a performance of remorse. A man stripped to his actual dimensions, telling the truth because it was the only thing he had left to offer that was entirely his own. "You should have told me from the beginning," she said. "Yes. You will not keep things from me again." His gaze held hers. "No," he said, and it was the most unconditional word she had ever heard him speak. She stepped inside. They were married in March, and not on the 15th. That date passed quietly, without ceremony, the debt instrument destroyed as promised, and the Hartwell house secure. The wedding came 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early spring when the London light had begun, tentatively, to remember what warmth felt like. It was not a large wedding. Vivian had declined the production that Lady Forsyth had been quietly assembling since January, and Wycliffe had, with visible relief, concurred. The guest list was spare. The church was old and smelled of stone and beeswax and the accumulated prayers of several centuries. Georgiana sat in the first pew and wore the expression of a woman who has been vindicated in a long-held private opinion. Vivian's father was present. He had aged, she thought, in the 3 weeks since she had sat with him and told him. With the careful, to surgical precision she had applied to all difficult things, exactly what she knew, what Wycliffe knew, and what the public notice in 3 newspapers had made irreversible. He had not argued, he had sat with it the way people sit with the full invoice of their choices when the avoidance strategies have finally been exhausted. She did not know yet what she would do with that. She suspected it would take years to understand and longer to resolve, and she had decided, quietly, on a Wednesday morning with tea and clear light, that she was capable of holding both her grief about it and her love for him without requiring them to become the same thing. Life was long. There was time. Wycliffe stood at the altar with the stillness that was simply his nature. Not cold, she understood now, not the armor she had first read it as, but the particular quality of a man who has learned to be very careful with everything and is slowly, at considerable personal cost, unlearning the necessity. He had been, over 3 weeks, in the process of this unlearning. She had watched it with the attention she gave to things that mattered. It was not swift, it was not graceful. It was the halting, ungainly work of a person dismantling what they built for survival and finding, beneath the scaffolding, something that had survived anyway. He had also, in those 3 weeks, begun to tell her about Cecily. Not everything, not at once, but in the manner of someone who has kept a room locked for 4 years and is learning to open the door incrementally. A detail over dinner, a memory offered with the careful hands of a man unused to offering anything. Thus she listened without performing comfort. She asked questions when she had them. She understood that this was not something that concluded. It was something that continued, quietly, in the long country of a shared life. When the ceremony ended and the register was signed, they stepped outside together into the pale March sun, and Lucian, she had been calling him that for 3 weeks now, and it still did each time the small private work of reminding her that he was a person and not a monument, stood for a moment on the church steps with the light on his face, and she saw something move through his expression that she did not yet have a name for. She would name it eventually. She was a patient woman, when something was worth patience. "Well," she said. He looked at her. That complete, unhurried attention, oars which she no longer found assessing and now found simply intimate, the way a very particular kind of looking becomes, over time, a form of language. "Well," he said. Georgiana was descending the steps behind them. The carriage waited. The spring light fell on the stones of the street without prejudice or preference, as light always does. On the difficult and the fortunate alike, on the old grief and the new arrangement, on the woman who had made a careless joke in January, and the man who had been standing outside the door for 8 minutes, trying to decide what he still wanted from the world. Vivian took his arm. It was not forgiveness, entirely. Not yet. It was the decision to walk in the same direction, which was, she had come to understand, how all the lasting things began. Not in the grand, conclusive moment, but in the small, a deliberate, daily choice to keep going. She had made worse bets. The carriage door opened. London spread before them in its ordinary, extraordinary entirety, and Vivian Hartwell, vain now and still herself, which was the only terms on which she had ever been willing to proceed, stepped forward into it. 1 year later, there was a garden. Not the austere architectural grounds that had surrounded Wycliffe House when Vivian first arrived. Those she had left largely intact, because they suited the house and she had no quarrel with a thing simply because it predated her. But on the east side of the property, where a neglected walled enclosure had been used for nothing in particular for the better part of a decade, there was now a garden that was entirely her own. She had designed it herself, over a winter of evenings at the desk in the library. Her desk now, pulled to face his, so that they worked in the same room without being required to perform companionship, which was, she had discovered, one of the finer architectures of a marriage between two people who valued silence and each other in roughly equal measure. The garden had lavender along the south wall, and an old stone bench that had come from somewhere in the Wycliffe estate's history, worn smooth by decades of some previous occupant's use. There was a fig tree that would take years to properly establish. There was a section Vivian had designated, with the same methodical precision she brought to all things, for whatever she decided to plant next, which she had not yet decided, and was content not to have decided. She was in the garden on an October afternoon when Lucian found her. The light was the particular amber of autumn, generous and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that makes everything look like something worth remembering. He came through the gate without announcement, which was the habit he had developed over 12 months of learning that she did not require forewarning, that she was not a woman who needed to compose herself before his arrival because she had never been composing herself. She had always simply been there. He sat on the stone bench. She remained standing, her hands in the earth, which was where they frequently were. "Letter from your aunt," he said, and held it out. "Leave it on the bench." He left it on the bench. He did not leave. she was aware of him watching her in the way she was always aware of him. Not as surveillance, not as assessment, but as attention. The particular quality of being seen by someone who has decided that seeing you is worth the sustained effort of looking. She had come to understand that this was how he loved, not in proclamation, not in the sweeping gestures that novels promised and life rarely delivered, in the sustained, deliberate, daily choice to pay attention, to stay in the room, to keep the door open. It had cost him something to learn this. She did not diminish that by calling it simple. "The fig tree is establishing," she said. "Is it?" "I wasn't certain it would. And the soil is heavier than I'd like on the north side." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. This man she had walked toward in fury, and walked away from in confusion, and walked back to in the end, not because the calculus had resolved itself into something clean, but because clean was not what she had wanted. She had wanted real. And real was this. A man on a stone bench in the October light, reading her aunt's letter without being asked, prepared to stay for as long as she remained in the garden. "Lucian." He looked up. She had still not found a single word for what moved across his face when she used his name. She had stopped needing one. "I think," she said, "that the fig tree will be fine." He held her gaze. The amber light lay across the old stone wall. Somewhere in the house, a door closed, and the sound of it was ordinary and domestic and entirely theirs. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." She turned back to the earth. He opened the letter. The garden held them both in the quiet, particular grace of a life that had not been easy, and had not been clean, and had become, in spite of everything, or perhaps because of it, exactly sufficient. The fig tree would take years. They had years, if you are still here. If you rode out the storm with Vivian, if you waited with her through every careful, guarded, costly step of Lucian learning how to stay, then this story was made for you. We write for the ones who believe that love is not a lightning strike, that it is a choice made again and again in the ordinary light of ordinary days, that the people worth trusting are the ones who tell you the truth even when it costs them. To that a heart that has been closed for a very long time is not a heart beyond reaching, only one that requires patience and time and someone brave enough to keep showing up. We hope some part of this found you. Now, we want to know something. Where in this beautiful world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Your city, your country, your little corner of the earth. We read every single one, and there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that a story, set in the drawing rooms and rain-soaked streets of Victorian London, is finding its way to living rooms and kitchens and late-night beds all across the globe. Are you watching from New York City? That magnificent, relentless place. Or perhaps from the quieter grace of Charleston or Savannah. From the golden sprawl of Los Angeles or the deep, dew-storied heart of New Orleans? Are you tucked into an autumn evening in London or Edinburgh, the very streets these stories breathe? Perhaps a rainy afternoon in Manchester or Dublin, where the weather, at least, requires no imagination. Are you watching the sun come up over Sydney Harbour, or settled into a cool Melbourne evening with something warm in your hands? Perhaps somewhere in Brisbane or Perth, where the light does things the Northern Hemisphere can only dream of. Are you in Toronto or Vancouver, watching the leaves turn, in Lagos or Nairobi, where this story has found you across every distance we could have imagined? In Paris or Amsterdam, in Auckland or Cape Town, in some small and particular and irreplaceable place that the algorithm delivered this to, and we are so glad it did. Tell us, and if this story moved you, if any single line of it landed somewhere it was meant to, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes, as we do, that love done right is worth every word. We will be here. We will keep writing. Come back soon.